In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the city of Birmingham found itself under siege by a motley assortment of street gangs. Today, popular culture has immortalized this era under the moniker Peaky Blinders. Some might think of debonair figures who engage in cunning ploys, sporting tailored suits and cutting a charismatic presence, yet the genuine story behind these lawless groups is far more chaotic. Out of the crumbling backstreets of England's industrial heartland emerged ruthless youth gangs that reveled in violence, petty theft, and intimidation. Their exploits and the deviant world in which they thrived laid the groundwork for even more ambitious turf wars down the line. To truly understand how these rabble-rousers gained such notoriety, it's essential to trace their roots. By the mid-19th century, economic strife had begun to plague Birmingham's poorest neighborhoods. Factories and foundries occasionally offered employment, but such work was neither consistent nor adequate to lift families from poverty. Young people often spent their free hours roaming the streets, unmoored from any formal recreational outlets. Through desperation or misguided excitement, many of these aimless adolescents soon became entangled in criminal acts. The first stirrings of street gangs, the sloggers. Before the Peaky Blinders label emerged, Birmingham authorities confronted crowds of rowdy teenagers linked by a shared penchant for street brawls. These loosely organized groups earned the nickname sloggers, a term initially used in the boxing world but adapted to describe tormentors who inflicted violent beatings beyond the ring. It didn't take long for residents to fear the name slogging gangs, which spread from the city's industrial outskirts into more urban areas. By the late 1850s, tension between an under-resourced police force and the rebellious youth boiled over. Pressed by politicians and upper-class reformers, law enforcement sought to clamp down on the rising delinquents. In response, these rough-and-tumble teenagers formed tighter alliances, a unity forged by a common resentment of authority. Clashes intensified in the 1870s, with some confrontations involving hundreds of participants swinging sticks, hurling stones, and resorting to any means to assert control over whichever corner of the city they chose. During these violent outbursts, bystanders rarely escaped unscathed. Men, women, the elderly, none were exempt from the sloggers' rampages. Authorities consistently found themselves short-staffed, and the city's poor living conditions offered criminals plenty of hideouts. In press reports, eyewitness accounts recounted hair-raising details of entire neighborhoods ransacked by hundreds of youths, smashing windows and hurling projectiles at police officers. These large-scale riots generated a climate of fear that tarnished Birmingham's reputation throughout Great Britain, prompting many to label it one of the most volatile places in the nation. Life in the shadows, when juveniles rule the streets. Among the sloggers, the average age hovered around 13 or 14, though some were barely older than 12. Their youthfulness often masked a raw, explosive aggression that took even seasoned authorities by surprise. In 1872, for instance, an incident involving a particularly large group of sloggers showcased how far they were willing to go. They brazenly threw rocks at policemen and passers-by alike, shattered windows, and sent any potential witnesses to the hospital with serious injuries. Even outrage from leading community figures had little effect. Citizens despaired over the near-constant state of anarchy. The city's magistrates, some of whom were physically attacked while opposing these violent throngs, demanded more robust law enforcement measures. However, repeated pleas fell on deaf ears because the police force, incompetent in number, struggled to monitor all the trouble-prone districts. By the 1880s, gloom hung over Birmingham's dimly lit streets. The gap between the city's impoverished inhabitants and the authorities grew wider, fueled by bitter resentment of what the working class perceived as overly harsh policing methods. Young workers, whose schedules freed them up after 6 p.m., had minimal lawful recreation. Left to their own devices, they turned to gambling, petty theft, and frequent scuffles with rival groups, devolving into a perpetual cycle of provocation and retaliation. The rise of the Peaky Blinders. A new name surfaced around 1890, one that would become an infamous point of reference for true crime enthusiasts: Peaky Blinders. Since they partially grew out of the slogger culture, these newly christened hoodlums shared many traits with their forebears: aggressive street fights, robberies, and a complete disregard for the safety of others. However, with their peculiar hats perched upon their heads at a jaunty angle, they stood out from other local gangs. Contrary to modern fictional portrayals, these young men did not radiate the suave sophistication seen in more recent retellings. Hailing from streets marked by poor sanitation and rickety houses, they wore clothes indicative of their economic standing: worn-out trousers, simple jackets, battered boots, and flat caps. There was nothing glamorous about their livelihood, which revolved around intimidation, small-scale theft, and unbridled aggression. A lasting legend related to the name Peaky Blinders is that they supposedly sewed razor blades into the brims of their caps, allowing them to swipe at victims' faces mid-brawl. Historians often doubt that story. Cheap, disposable razors were not readily available at the time. It is more likely that the gang's moniker derived from their habit of cocking their caps low over their eyes, giving the impression of stealth and concealment. Yet the violent aura that followed their every mention sufficed to stir fear among everyday citizens. Social dynamics and daily life. Although many of their members were teenagers, some even pre-teens, they typically held day jobs in local factories, foundries, or other working-class trades. After their shifts, they congregated on the streets to make trouble. These underworld secrets grew out of a system where children labored in menial positions, yet still had idle moments to occupy with mischief. Surviving records show that individuals as young as 12 found themselves in court for egregious offenses such as assault or robbery, reinforcing the image of the Peaky Blinders as a crime family of sorts, albeit one held together by fleeting alliances rather than a formal mafia structure. Eradication efforts begin. The scorching chaos these gangs brought to Birmingham could only last so long before state officials began mounting a fierce counteroffensive. At the turn of the 20th century, city leaders focused on recruiting and training new police officers. They believed that halting the unsolved mysteries of nightly street disruptions would require not only manpower, but also strategic insight. Enter an appointed police chief with a powerful resolve. This official vowed to crack down on youth crimes, pushing judges to mete out harsher sentences to deter offenders. This was no minor endeavor. Early attempts saw alarmingly high rates of attacks on officers. Year after year, the number of assaults looked staggering, pitting Birmingham's law enforcement, a force only a few hundred strong, against thousands of antagonistic youth marauders. During the first decade of the 1900s, the tide finally began to turn. In tandem with bolder prosecution from the courts, community initiatives created recreational programs aimed at giving teenagers constructive outlets. Boxing clubs sprouted up, presenting an alternative to random brawls in grim alleyways. Competition just might channel violent impulses into disciplined matches overseen by referees, or so the authorities hoped. These measures, in combination with social reforms that expanded youth education and offered more structured leisure activities, ultimately sapped the Peaky Blinders' hold on the city. By the outbreak of World War I, many from the gang had either enlisted in the military, moved into more established occupations, or simply vanished from the streets. Tragic though it was, the global conflict inevitably drew many of the young men into army service, and not all returned. From small-time thugs to notorious kingpins, Billy Kimber and the Birmingham Gang. Although the original Peaky Blinders mostly dissipated by the early 1900s, a more ambitious wave of organized crime took its place in Birmingham's underworld by the 1920s. One name in particular rose to prominence: Billy Kimber. This formidable figure led the so-called Birmingham Gang, also known as the Birmingham Boys. Unlike the ragtag hooligans of the late 19th century, these men orchestrated gambling, rackets, and protection schemes across racecourses nationwide. Unlike the fictional portrayal of some sleek adversary from London, Billy Kimber himself hailed from Birmingham, specifically from the Summer Lane area, a district known for its gritty character. He carried himself with imposing physicality and navigated the dark history of the era to develop a profitable racket. His enterprise thrived on intimidation and cunning, targeting bookmakers across England. It was not uncommon for them to launch brutal assaults if someone refused to pay for protection, a hallmark tactic of infamous syndicates worldwide. In contrast to the loosely assembled Peaky Blinders of yesteryear, Kimber's ensemble extended its operations beyond the local realm. Their presence emerged around 1910 and expanded steadily over the next 2 decades, reaching racecourses that dotted the British landscape. Their modus operandi involved taking over racetrack territory, demanding fees from bookmakers, and resorting to savage violence when threatened. The fateful encounter with Darby Sabini. As Billy Kimber's influence spread southward, he soon discovered a formidable adversary in London, Darby Sabini. Sabini commanded a group sometimes associated with an Italian background, earning him a menacing aura of real mafia stories. His men held sway over the southern racetracks, especially in or near the East End. By forging alliances with existing criminal circles, Sabini constructed an underworld empire governed by fear and supported by a vast network of loyal enforcers. When the Birmingham Gang invaded Sabini territory, friction quickly escalated. Kimber's men began shaking down Jewish bookmakers, expecting immediate compliance. One such victim, Alfie Solomons, refused to roll over and faced savage retaliation. This assault touched off a wider confrontation that some labeled the Racecourse War, with the Birmingham Gang facing off against Sabini's men in a fierce contest of intimidation and violent showdowns. Once again, normal citizens found themselves at the mercy of physically commanding mobsters vying for dominance. Alfie Solomons, a relentless bookmaker. Alfie Solomons, often overshadowed in mainstream retellings, nonetheless deserves a closer look. A Jewish bookmaker from London, he survived an onslaught by Kimber's crew that left him battered and humiliated. However, he refused to cower. Seeking protection, Solomons allied with Sabini. In time, he confronted the Birmingham Gang again with renewed resolve, a risky move in the underworld secrets swirling beneath the city's surface. Solomons exemplified the gritty resourcefulness of individuals forced to stand against a notorious kingpin, even if that meant forging alliances with equally lethal rivals. Stalemate and strategic withdrawal. After months of violent ambushes on both sides, Kimber and Sabini navigated toward an uneasy truce. The Racecourse War had inflicted injuries and losses on all involved, while local authorities, determined not to let racetrack chaos spiral further out of control, began cracking down on illegal gambling rings. The threat of heightened law enforcement and potential prison sentences forced the adversaries to contemplate a period of cautious withdrawal. As the landscape of British organized crime shifted, Kimber found his empire vulnerable to raids and intensifying scrutiny. Rumors suggest that at one point he traveled to the United States, possibly in search of new prospects or to evade legal pressure back home. Although he eventually returned to England, the heyday of his extortion network had passed, undone partly by determined state officials who refused to let these crime families wreak unchecked havoc. The murky reality behind Thomas Shelby and fictional echoes. Many admirers of Peaky Blinders in modern pop culture might believe that real-life criminals once epitomized the cunning, poise, and entrepreneurial flair of the show's main characters. The truth is more nuanced. There was no historical Thomas Shelby, nor an Arthur Shelby, leading operations in 1920s Birmingham as described on screen. Yet certain families in the real city possessed some parallels, such as the Sheldons, who lived near actual pubs that appear in fictional adaptations. The Sheldons were known troublemakers, engaging in intimidation around racetracks. They did not, however, build a multi-city empire or ascend to mythic gangster status like the scripted storylines might suggest. The fictional retelling merges glimpses from several historical sources. It draws upon the Sloggers, the Peaky Blinders, the Sheldons, and the genuinely formidable Birmingham Gang as led by Billy Kimber. By weaving these threads together, the adaptation crafts a dramatized portrayal that enthralls viewers, blending true crime backdrops with creative liberties and a stylish aesthetic. While these flourishes capture the mood, it's crucial to remember that the unvarnished facts reveal something far more primal and disorganized: the youth club revolution and social reforms. A lesser-known aspect of the dark history surrounding these regiments of street toughs concerns how local charitable organizers gradually steered idle youths toward less destructive pastimes. Some philanthropic individuals offered safe environments for teenagers, boxing clubs, billiards halls, and social centers, hoping to reduce the attraction of random street fights. The logic was simple. If bored adolescents could channel their vigor into sports or structured competition, perhaps persistent brawling would diminish. These community projects, bolstered by political reforms from the early 1900s onward, eventually began to pay dividends. Educational reforms played a pivotal role in shaping a generation of children who saw the benefits of literacy and recognized alternatives beyond the lure of petty crimes. Health initiatives also emerged, guaranteeing basic medical checkups and modest nutritional meals to underprivileged youth. Such changes might sound mundane, but they amounted to a transformative development in communities historically battered by unemployment and physical suffering. Fallout of World War I. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 influenced the fate of the Peaky Blinders and similar groups in myriad ways. Employment patterns shifted drastically as the war effort demanded labor in munitions factories, engineering, and other vital industries. Conscription further dismantled the local youth population that once roamed the night in search of trouble. By the war's conclusion, the survivors who returned often did so with new perspectives, shaped by the atrocities they had witnessed. Many found it difficult to fall back into the petty street life they once embraced so fiercely. At the same time, hard-boiled criminals who continued operating after the war found an evolving landscape. The vacuum left by young neighbors who never came home sometimes allowed these individuals to consolidate authority. It's no coincidence that figures like Billy Kimber went on to exploit the racetracks in the 1920s. He capitalized on a post-war era where gambling provided a form of escapism to populations eager for excitement after years of conflict. Meanwhile, authorities redirected attention to other economic issues, inadvertently giving him an opening to expand his territory. Shifting sands, the later life of Birmingham criminals. Most of the Peaky Blinders from the late 1800s had vanished by the Roaring Twenties, overshadowed by the rise of racetrack extortion rings. Still, echoes of that earlier tribe resounded in local legends. Old convicts, aged and hardened, sometimes emerged from jail to discover that a new generation of criminals now ran the city's underworld secrets. By the mid-1920s, syndicated criminal activity across Britain became more refined, marking a departure from the brawling teen mobs. Continuing true crime sagas involved weapon smuggling, advanced racketeering enterprises, and elaborate heists. The era of teenage gangs using belts and bricks gave way to more sinister and structured organized crime networks. Heroes in uniform? While the mainstream enthrallment often focuses on the criminals themselves, mythologizing them as cunning masterminds, there were everyday men and women who stood valiantly against these infamous syndicates. Policemen and local watchmen risked their safety on a nightly basis to confront sizable mobs. Countless accounts detail how outnumbered authorities battled intimidating throngs only to be struck with bricks and clubs. Some officers sustained crippling injuries, cutting their careers short. Nonetheless, they persevered, often with little praise. They remain the unsung heroes who refused to let notorious kingpins overrun their city without resistance. Neighborhood residents likewise deserve acknowledgement. In an era when retribution could be swift, civilians still came forward with testimonies crucial in convicting offenders. Random bystanders risked everything to protect family members from rampaging gangs and might have found themselves implicated in petty retaliations. The genuine gallantry displayed by many citizens earns them a rightful place in the annals of local history. Their efforts, along with determined legal reforms, are what eventually chipped away at the foundation these gangs relied upon. Dismantling the legendary aura. One of the most critical takeaways from this dark history is the distinction between sensationalized, narrative and everyday reality. The young men at the heart of the Peaky Blinders phenomenon were neither well-heeled masterminds nor revered figures among the general populace. Instead, they were rash toughs, thriving off fear and adolescent bravado. Similarly, their 1920s successors like Billy Kimber and rival bosses built their fortunes by threatening and assaulting those unwilling to fall in line. Their methods perpetuated cycles of pain that they themselves struggled to fully control in the long run. Throughout the 20th century, movies, television, and novels have often romanticized the idea of a crime family with style and cunning. But the historical record reminds us that these individuals were often unscrupulous, ready to betray allies if it suited them. Their worlds were shaped by constant uncertainty, almost reminiscent of unsolved mysteries, where a single miscalculation could see them dethroned. The story remains a cautionary testimony to how quickly hobnobbing with criminals can devolve into savage showdowns on deserted backstreets. Aftermath of the Racecourse Wars. Eventually, increased police surveillance forced bookmakers and unlicensed gambling operators to either relocate or endure rising danger. While that spelled major challenges for the Birmingham Gang and the Sabini faction, it did not instantly dissolve criminal enterprises. Many simply adapted their methods. Sabini, for example, faced repeated police crackdowns, prompting him to shift activities into more covert rackets. Kimber, too, underwent a forced transformation in how he ran businesses, adopting a lower profile in order to dodge official suspicion. By the late 1920s, the racetrack environment was notably less chaotic. Wagering laws were tightened, and local forces honed new tactics for capturing known criminals. Despite continuing illegal practices, the scale of overt violence dropped compared to the peak of the Racecourse War. Security staffers patrolled events more thoroughly, hoping to reassure mainstream spectators that they could place bets without fear of being strong-armed. Though episodic skirmishes persisted, the days of large-scale brawls waged openly by Kimber's men against Sabini's supporters became a fleeting memory. Legacy and cultural memories. Despite all the turmoil and brutality, the Peaky Blinders left an indelible mark on Birmingham's cultural consciousness. Even long after these gangs ceased to exist in their original form, older locals sometimes recounted terrifying experiences from decades prior. Newspapers reprinted tales of the rampages. Local history enthusiasts chronicled specific incidents, preserving them for posterity. Far from the cinematic adaptation's glamorous sheen, these were recollections of neighbors battered in the streets or children hurried away to safety while rocks rained down on unsuspecting victims. At the same time, the mention of Peaky Blinders in modern conversation conjures a strange romanticism. Part of that allure stems from how imagination can recast grim realities as enthralling sagas, a phenomenon that grips audiences fascinated by organized crime and real mafia stories. The difference between the savage true crime events and their dramatized counterparts often blurs past recognition. Yet behind every charismatic anti-hero in fiction lies a raw historical basis that was infinitely more chaotic. A tale of two eras. We can divide Birmingham's gangster timeline into distinct phases. First came the sloggers, those roving bands of youth born out of the mid to late 19th century's dire poverty. Their street fights and thefts earned them a reputation for savagery that overshadowed any notion of carefully orchestrated goals. Peaky Blinders emerged in the final decade of the 1800s, carrying on that tradition of group cohesion, local intimidation, and petty tyranny. By the 1900s, various social developments, improved policing, philanthropic programs for youth, legal reforms, gradually eroded these miscreant communities. When World War I erupted, the old guard effectively disappeared. Subsequent underworld players were older, more methodical, and far more interested in specific criminal enterprises like racecourse rackets or extortion. This marked the second phase, exemplified by Billy Kimber. His underworld secrets shaped a new brand of large-scale intimidation beyond the city limits, forging alliances and grudges that aimed to corner entire markets. Harsh realities of racketeering. For ordinary citizens, the racket environment often proved inescapable. In the early 20th century, gambling was a widespread extracurricular pursuit, whether legal or not. Bookmakers operated at horse tracks across Britain, attracting everyone from working-class punters to wealthy aristocrats. Criminal organizations immediately saw opportunities for profit, imposing protection fees on the bookies. If the fees were not forthcoming, intimidation swiftly followed. Violence might escalate from menacing threats to outright battery or sabotage. The city's gangster networks thereby sustained themselves by taxing a thriving pastime in the name of security. These types of extortion rings were hardly unique to Birmingham or even the UK. Over in the United States, gangster outfits employed similar methods around casinos and urban neighborhoods. Across Europe, infamous syndicates capitalized on local markets to maximize revenues. The Birmingham Gang, with Billy Kimber at the helm, documented how easily such tactics could flourish in a place short on official oversight and brimming with eager gamblers. Still, the scale, reach, and ultimate downfall of these groups reflect a cyclical dynamic. A new wave arises, only to be brought low by either a stronger force or internal collapses. Collective fascination. Why do gangster chronicles continue to resonate so powerfully? Part of the answer lies in the allure of crime families, that sense of hidden enclaves operating according to codes unknown to mainstream society. The combination of aggression, forbidden enterprise, and high-stakes showdowns has for centuries drawn public intrigue. More so, tales of rebellion capture imaginations. People both abhor and find themselves enthralled by the bravado required to defy law and order, even when such defiance leads to immense suffering. The historical record of the Peaky Blinders, Birmingham Gang, and others contradicts the immaculate style or moral conflicts sometimes showcased in fictional retellings. Real participants seldom lived in grand houses. They frequently inhabited squalid conditions and carried out extortion as a matter of survival or greed. Yet, they remain compelling in the same way that disasters enthrall onlookers, something horrifying but enthralling about observing society's fringes. Revelations and unsolved mysteries. A handful of unexplained cases from the era keep researchers guessing. Some murders attributed to unknown Peaky Blinder affiliates never saw resolution. Witnesses were too scared to testify or vanished under shady circumstances. At times, battered victims refused to speak to authorities out of fear of retribution. This climate of fear created an environment thick with unsolved mysteries that historians still debate. Did certain feuds get settled out in the open? Or were bodies hidden in the labyrinth of canals that wound through Birmingham? We cannot say for sure, but the patchy archival records hint at a citywide tapestry of secrets seldom revealed in full. The triumph of community over fear. Despite the gloom that grips these true crime accounts, there emerged a broader triumph by the end of the 1920s. The average citizen, backed by a better-equipped police force, demanded a safer environment. Courts handed harsher sentences to individuals involved in violent extortion, no longer brushing aside underage offenders or ignoring the reality that repeated petty convictions pointed to organized wrongdoing. This shift in judicial perspective meant that local gangsters, from small-time bullies to notorious kingpins, faced an increasingly formidable system. Moreover, grassroots changes, community centers, schooling improvements, the creation of sports leagues drew younger generations away from the throes of lawlessness. While not erasing crime entirely, these measures reduced the reservoir of future recruits. By the time the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, the shape of the underworld had reorganized, gravitating more toward professional smuggling or black markets for contraband. Street gangs still existed, but the local spree of uniformed caps and large-scale teenage riots was largely a memory from another age. Lessons from a turbulent past. Retrospect offers perspective on the forces that molded the Peaky Blinders and other groups of that era. Industrialization led to cramped housing, underpaid labor, and minimal social welfare. Neighborhoods devolved into pockets of desperation. Youthful misfits discovered that banding together provided an outlet for pent-up rage and an opportunity to assert control, no matter how fleeting. Violence escalated as police struggled to contain the anarchy. Power vacuums gave small but aggressive bands room to flourish. Over time, however, cohesive government action, grassroots social movements, and broader economic transformations limited the room in which these gangs operated. The storyline from Sloggers to Peaky Blinders to Billy Kimber's Birmingham Gang underscores how localized violence can incubate more sophisticated criminal undertakings. Once territory is claimed and petty theft evolves into extortion, the impetus to branch out regionally or nationally becomes irresistible for certain unscrupulous figures. Reminders of human cost. In the midst of such narratives, it's easy to gloss over the innocent lives upended. In the late 19th century, many impoverished families lived in fear of knockabout youths who might snap into a frenzy for relatively trivial reasons. By the 1920s, that same anxiety loomed in the form of highly organized racetrack syndicates. Bookmakers working alone had few recourses if they couldn't afford the bribes demanded by Kimber, Sabini, or their henchmen. Anyone refusing to comply risked bodily harm or financial ruin. Meanwhile, some young people ensnared in gang life came from heartbreakingly disadvantaged origins. The adrenaline of street battles was, for them, a chance to be seen, to feel powerful in a society that otherwise dismissed them. Thus, the tragedies of that period involved not just the stories of beaten victims, but also the self-destructive cycle that trapped so many near-destitute youths in the cogs of crime, an ongoing fascination. The legacy of the Peaky Blinders endures. Period newspapers reveal how news stories about these gangs spread like wildfire, fueling fear and generating a lurid fascination. Modern viewers remain captivated by the depiction of a bold, rebellious underworld figure clad in a brimmed cap, though the authentic historical facts underscore less refinement and bigger crowds of impulsive aggressors. This ongoing interest demonstrates society's complex relationship with criminals who dare to break conventional rules. Looking back and forward. In hindsight, the story of 19th and early 20th century Birmingham crime is more than a violent footnote. It also stands as a chronicle of how economic struggles, class resentments, and underdevelopment can catalyze waves of youthful lawlessness. It illustrates how, left unchecked, rowdy adolescent mobs evolve into organized crime networks. Even so, it is likewise an account of how unflagging community members, dedicated officials, and strategic reforms eventually stem the tide. Might the Peaky Blinders have become a footnote sooner had there been more investment in education, youth programs, and police resources? Quite possibly. The importance of proactive engagement in deprived communities remains a lesson relevant even today, when different forms of crime hamper major urban centers around the world. Each era has its challenges, and while the brand of street violence might change shape, the underlying socio-economic drivers endure. Final reflections. Changing times brought about new opportunities, from formal employment lines to broader social freedoms. Residents finally felt the weight of relentless fear lifting as justice cracked down on ringleaders and carved a path to safer neighborhoods. The children of ex-gang members grew up in a radically shifted environment, with many adopting trades unrelated to the streets. Although some advanced criminals like Billy Kimber hung on to the last vestiges of their racetrack dominion, that golden age of racetrack extortion ended as forcibly as it began. It can be argued that the Peaky Blinders phenomenon remains a minor piece of a grander puzzle. Yet it is a piece that continues to command significant attention from historians, true crime buffs, and lovers of dark history. The aura of danger and subversion that underpinned these stories endures, revealing universal themes about how marginalized youths can morph into fearsome street gangs, or how impoverished neighborhoods spawn vigilante justice, or how notorious kingpins can rise from humble backgrounds to dominate entire illicit markets. Each echoes the unyielding tension between order and chaos inscribed across the pages of the past. What endures most powerfully are the real voices of those who lived through it. The battered shopkeepers, the exhausted policemen, the mothers who dreaded nightfall, and the battered youth who either perished in a brawl or spent a life behind bars. Their experiences sift through the fictional glamour, reminding the modern observer that behind every flamboyant gangster tale is a very real cost, pain, loss, and disillusionment. Ultimately, that is the stark reminder left by the story of the real Peaky Blinders and the subsequent gangster armies that seized Birmingham for a spell, only to fracture under the unrelenting pushback from a society exasperated with chaos. In that regard, the narrative remains a vivid focal point of true crime, organized crime, real mafia stories, dark history, underworld secrets, crime families, unsolved mysteries, and infamous syndicates. It speaks to the precarious balance a community strikes when confronted with unstoppable rogues. Yet it also testifies to the resilience of common people who time and again stand up to those who mistake fear for power. The difference between fiction and reality becomes clear upon close examination. Despite their fearsome reputation, the Peaky Blinders were not skillfully organized. Most never moved beyond Birmingham's borders, and their run-ins with the law usually led to short stints in prison, anywhere from a few days to a few months. Strangely, repeated arrests didn't appear to deter them. Authorities often displayed leniency, perhaps due to the highly centralized judicial system's struggle to manage a widespread outbreak of juvenile delinquency in an industrial city still grappling with modernization.